Lisa.
Alright, well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Alice Coleman, and today I'm going to be discussing my thesis project, which is a comparative study on the use and perceptions of public relations in nonprofit organizations. So, as a PR student with an interest in the nonprofit sector, when it came time to decide on my thesis, I kind of naturally gravitated towards this topic. So I came to Dr. Wu with just a general idea, and he kind of helped me develop it into this study that I have here today. And so for this study, I focused on traditional communication usage, social media adoption and usage, and the perception of communications efforts, which I will get more into what those terms mean in a minute. And to do this, I did an analysis that included a 15-question survey, Form 990 data collection from GuideStar, and social media analytics that I gathered from visiting all the social media pages myself, and also using the website Fanpage Karma. And I'll get into more of that later, but I just wanted to give an overview of what this project really is. And it included 197 Arizona nonprofit organizations, so it's a pretty large sample size. So before I go into my study, I'd like to talk about the studies that really influenced the design of my project. The first is this 2009 study of 275 donors of a food bank. And it was a 15-question survey that was looking at the relationship quality with their donors. And they were looking at 3 indicators: commitment, satisfaction, and trust, and how communications really affected these different aspects of the relationship. And what they found is that through the use of various communications efforts, these 3 qualities increased. So basically, these communications efforts are contributing to better donor relationships, which is what makes communications so important. I also found multiple studies looking at social media adoption in particular among nonprofit organizations. The first, this one on the left, was a 2009 study that looked at individual practitioners and how they participated in social media, what their tendency to adopt it, and their perceived credibility of the platforms. And they also, interestingly, they looked at whether the organization had a public relations department and if that impacted their efforts and their perception of it. And actually they found that the organizations that had public relations departments didn't necessarily adopt social media any more than those that didn't. And so these are insightful, but because it was a study from 2009, the tools that they were looking at are very outdated. They were considering email as a social media tool, which we typically don't consider that social media anymore. In the second study, the one on the right, in 2014, it kind of builds upon and fills in the gaps from the 2009 study. And this looked specifically at human services providers. And this is county organizations, funders, and service providers. And they really were just trying to understand how they were using this social media. And so they were looking at how many accounts they had, whether they had a blog. And another thing that they did was they considered whether the organization served a vulnerable population, such as children or domestic violence victims, because this can impact their use of social media. It makes it more difficult for them to post pictures and things like that about what they're doing, just because of the type of work that they're doing. And they expanded upon this social media analysis with interviews and a content analysis. So beyond just metrics, they were looking at the content of their Facebook pages. And similar to my study, they found that Facebook was the most common platform, but in that study, only 49% of the organizations had Facebook pages, which is fairly different from what I found, which I'll get to later. They also found that the most common reasons for organizations to use social media was to promote their activities. So this is something that I touched on as well, as the purpose of social media for these organizations. And so that was something that really influenced my research design. Another study that really impacted the way that I designed this project was this 2012 study, and they were looking at more broad organizational factors and how that relates to social media usage and adoption. So they were looking at board size and total assets and things like that to see if that has an impact on their social media efforts. So they looked at a sample of the 100 largest non-educational nonprofit organizations in the United States, and despite that these were the largest organizations, only 73% of them had Twitter and 65 had Facebook, which is actually pretty low. Granted, it was 2012, so it's really when social media was just catching on for organizations and businesses, and so it really shows how much social media has grown in the past 3 to 4 years. So based on they looked at data from these organizations' Facebook and Twitter accounts, as well as their Form 990s, and one of the biggest findings was that there was no relationship between organization size and social media adoption and use. So again, like, organizations that had more money aren't necessarily more likely to dedicate resources to social media. This, as I mentioned, this was really influential in my study as well, because it's the reason that I decided to use Form 990 data in my research as well. So other studies that I looked at focused on specific social media platforms, such as this one in 2011, and they sought to answer the fairly basic question: to what extent are nonprofit organizations using the model of public relations on Twitter? So there's 4 different models of public relations that they looked at: press agency, public information, two-way asymmetry, and two-way symmetry. And without going too much into what each of these terms means, essentially the first 2 is one-way communication. So they're pushing out information, not really trying to engage in a dialogue, which is more what social media platforms are intended to do. They're intended to connect with a community. And so they coded a bunch of tweets from 27 large organizations, and they found that public information, so pushing out information to their followers, was the most common model. And this is something that you're going to see in these other studies that I'm talking about, and I've also found in my study, is that really the main purpose that these organizations are using social media for is to push out information, not to engage in a dialogue. 2 other studies that looked at Twitter in particular are these 2 here. The one on the left, they looked at 4,600 tweets and coded them based on how they were using the features of the platform. So how many had hyperlinks, how many had the mentions, retweets, and hashtags, to see if they were really taking advantage of the features that this platform offers. And these also indicate how they're using it to connect. So a large number of mentions suggest that they're making conversation, because that's when you tag another user, and a lot of times that's used to engage in a conversation. And another unique thing that they looked at was following practices. So of the 73 organizations that they looked at, they created an account and they followed each one, and they saw how many of them followed back. And because that's sort of something that reflects on how they interact with their community as well. And they found only 17 of the 73 followed them back. Later on, the same data set was used in a different study, and they created a 12-category scheme to look at the purpose of the tweets. So they ended up classifying it into 3 major functions, which were information tweets, which was informing about upcoming events and things like that. Community tweets, which were aimed at fostering relationships and, as I said, creating a dialogue. And action tweets, which were aimed at trying to get followers to do something, so to donate, to attend an event, something of that nature. They found that the majority, 59%, were informational tweets, and 26% were community building, and just 1.6% were considered action tweets, so trying to get someone to do something. And using that information, they classified the organizations into 3 different types of users: info sources, community builders, and promoters and mobilizers. This was what I used as a model when I was coming up with how I was going to ask organizations what they were using social media for. So you'll see that later on as I get into my project. So based on all of this, I developed these 3 research questions. The first is just generally, how do nonprofit organizations use and perceive communication efforts? The second is, does the type of nonprofit organization have an effect on the usage of communications tactics? And the third is, does the type of organization have an effect on the perception of communications within that organization? So based on these research questions, I formulated 5 hypotheses. I hypothesized that there would be a significant difference between human services and animal-related organizations in Arizona with respect to the use of traditional communications tactics, general social media usage, Twitter usage and engagement, Facebook usage and engagement, and the perception of communication tactics within the organization. So before we continue, I want to just establish what those terms mean with respect to this study. Traditional communications encompasses the employment status of the person responsible for communications. So is it a full-time staff member, part-time, is it a volunteer? And it also just essentially refers to non-social media efforts, things that these organizations have been doing for a long time. So it also includes newsletter and press release usage, as well as the distribution frequency of that newsletter. So how often is it distributed? Monthly, quarterly, annually. Social media usage refers to the number of social media accounts that the organization has, how many followers they have on those accounts, and whether or not the CEO actively uses social media for professional purposes, because previous studies have suggested that if the CEO uses social media, that's an indicator of whether the organization will use it as well. And then the perception of communications is based off of 6 Likert scale statements that I created, and the participants were asked to rate these statements based on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And I'll show you those questions in a minute. As for Twitter and Facebook usage and engagement, there's a lot of ways that you can measure these. There are so many different tools and sites that have different metrics. I used the site Fanpage Karma, and so for the purposes of this study, I looked at 14 variables for Twitter and 21 variables for Facebook. The Twitter variables include the page performance index, which essentially rates the page in comparison to other Twitter pages on the Fanpage Karma site. So it's a percentile figure. Then average weekly growth, the number of tweets per day to see how actively they're using the platform, how many of these tweets are conversations, which they calculate by how often they tag other users. And the site has its own engagement metric as well, which is they calculate by dividing the total number of interactions by the number of followers that account has. And interactions refers to the number of retweets and favorites, as that's really the main ways that you can interact with other users on Twitter. And so for Facebook, there were 21 different variables. Similar to Twitter, there was a page performance index, which compares it to other Facebook pages, and there's the weekly follower growth. Interaction was measured by total likes, shares, and comments. And then the total posts by fans, because that measures how often people are choosing to go to that page and interact with them and post on their page. So it's one of the greatest forms of interaction that you can have on the platform. And another unique thing for Facebook was that there were variables that considered what kind of content is being posted on the page. So they looked at the number of photo, video, and link posts. And so together, all of that is what is being considered Facebook usage and engagement in this project. So now for the design of the project and how it all really fits together. I mentioned it briefly earlier, but now we're going to go a little more in depth about what I did here. The first part was a 15-question survey, and questions in this survey addressed all the different aspects that I mentioned: traditional communication, social media, and also perception. The second part is a social media analysis. In the survey, I asked which platforms their organizations had accounts on, and their answers, I searched for those organizations on each of the 7 most popular, most common platforms among organizations. That's Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, Google+, and Pinterest. And as I mentioned, this was based on self-reported information. So if the organization said they only had a Facebook page, I only searched for them on Facebook. I would find their account and I would record how many followers that they had. And in addition to that sort of manual data collection, I entered all of the Facebook and Twitter accounts for the organizations into the FanPage Karma website, and that site then calculated all the key performance indicators that I mentioned previously. And then finally, I collected data from each of the organizations' Form 990. The Form 990 is a tax form that all nonprofit organizations are required to fill out some version of each year in order to keep their tax-exempt status. Depending on the size of the organization, the type of form they're required to fill out varies. Some are much shorter, and the information on those forms varies as well, which kind of made data collection difficult. So, how did I choose the organizations that I did? It was a much more difficult process than I had anticipated. I knew that I wanted to include animal-related organizations because that's what I'm passionate about, but I wanted to be able to make a meaningful comparison to some other type of nonprofit. And then I learned about the Giving USA report in my fundraising class, taught by my second reader. And this report details the annual contributions to nonprofit organizations each year in the United States, including a breakdown by nonprofit type. And as you can see, well, you might not be able to, it's kind of hard. Animal-related organizations combined with environmental only get 3% of annual contributions. So it's the least amount of contributions besides gifts to individuals. So when I saw this, I thought that it would be meaningful to compare it to a type of organization that's on the other side of the spectrum. As you can see, religion is the largest, but religious organizations are not required to fill out tax information, so that would have made trying to get information, data collection, really difficult. So I didn't choose to do religion. And then education can include very large universities, and trying to compare that to small animal welfare organizations wouldn't really make a meaningful comparison. So I decided to go with human services. To identify these organizations, I used the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities classification system, and under this system, each organization is given a letter and number combination that designates the type of organization. And this is the classification system that GuideStar uses to sort its organizations, so it made finding the organizations much easier using this classification. So initially, I planned on using systematic sampling to go through the 1,600 organizations on GuideStar that fit my criteria and choose every 7th one until I reach my sample size of 200. But when I did that, I found that a large portion of the organizations had no online presence at all, which, when I'm trying to look at social media, it's very difficult when they don't even have a website. So then I started to look for other ways that I could find large lists of organizations. I went to the ASU Lodestar Center, which has positioned itself as a thought leader in the nonprofit sector, but I wasn't really able to find any lists that I could use. Oops. Yeah. So when that didn't work, I just decided to go through all 1,600 organizations one by one and Google them. And in doing so, I documented their website and their contact information. So all organizations that fit into those categories that had a website and an email contact were included. The email contact was necessary because that's how the survey was going to be sent. So if I didn't have that, they were not included. So that left 375 animal-related and 549 human services organizations that fit the criteria. And I emailed the survey to 921 organizations in Arizona, which is more than 4 times the original sample that I had intended. So just to give a little timeline of how this all happened, I sent the survey on August 6, 2015. And then over a 3-week period in August and September, I recorded all the number of social media followers that I mentioned, going to each account and recording each. And then from October to November, I searched each organization on GuideStar and documented specific information from their Form 990s. So things like total revenue, number of employees, number of volunteers. And then at the end of November / beginning of December, I entered all of the Facebook and Twitter accounts into the FanPage Karma website, and I analyzed each account for the entire month of November. So, of the 921 emails that I sent, 864 were delivered, and 203 organizations completed the survey. This is a 23.5% response rate, which is pretty comparable to the other studies that I saw, and actually even higher than some that I found in my literature review. And from those responses, there were 197 that were usable, 73 of which were from animal-related organizations, 122 were from human services, and there were 2 organizations that are actually classified as both animal-related and human services organizations. So, of these 197 organizations, 30% did not have a recent Form 990 available on the GuideStar website. 23% had the Form 990 EZ, which is required for smaller organizations, and then 44% had a full Form 990. So why is this the case? As I mentioned earlier, the type of Form 990 depends on how big the organization is. So organizations with gross receipts less than $50,000 a year are only required to fill out the Form 990N, which is only an 8-question online application that doesn't even include any revenue information. So that could be why a lot of the organizations didn't have anything available on GuideStar. Another note about these differing forms is that it made data collection a challenge because for some organizations I had no revenue information, and then for others I had limited information. So the Form 990 EZ does not include any information on board members, employees, or volunteers. So these numbers here are only organizations that had the full Form 990 available. Based on that, I did find that the average number of board members was 9.4, the average number of employees was 40, and the average number of volunteers was 276. While looking at the Form 990 data, I also documented total annual revenue and assets. And then I grouped them by revenue to better understand the organizations that I was dealing with. As you can see, there's a fairly even distribution between small, medium, and large organizations. This is 22% with $0 to $100,000 in annual revenue, 29.6% with $100,000 to $1 million, and 17.1% that have revenues greater than $1 million. And there was definitely a huge variation in this sample. There was one organization that had reported $956 in annual revenue and another that had more than $51 million. So it was really a range. So moving on to the survey results, the first question I asked is who's in charge of the communications or public relations efforts within your organization? And if this was a check all that apply question, so if they chose either full-time or part-time staff member as an option, they would get the question, what is the position title for the staff member most involved in these efforts? And as you can see, a majority of the organizations leave this responsibility to volunteers. However, full-time staff member was not far behind. There were about 90 respondents who said that this was the responsibility of a full-time staff member. So as for the position title, I found an overwhelming majority of the respondents said that the staff member who handled this was the CEO. So I did an analysis of their responses and found 43 of them said something along the lines of CEO, executive director, founder, or president. 14 identified position titles related to communications, PR, or marketing. 13 included fundraising, development, donor, philanthropy, or financial. And 10 included community and or engagement, or outreach, sorry. So these findings suggest that this responsibility is often falling to the person who's also tasked with running the entire organization, which is not an effective way to do things, but is the reality when these organizations lack the resources to do anything. With traditional communication, as I mentioned earlier, I looked at both newsletters and press releases. I found that 55% do have a regular newsletter, and a majority of these are distributed monthly. I also found that a majority of organizations use press releases and media alerts to tell the news organizations about new developments within their organization. As for social media usage, this is a breakdown of the number of respondents who had accounts on these different platforms. So as with previous studies, Facebook was by far the most common social media platform. 93% of the respondents said that their organization had Facebook accounts. And then in terms of the number of respondents who had accounts, you can see Facebook, Twitter, YouTube are the top three. But if you look at the number of followers on these accounts, it actually is Facebook first, followed by Twitter, and then Instagram. So despite the fact that more than 40% of the organizations had YouTube accounts, the average number of followers on these accounts was only 43. And by comparison, the average number of followers on Instagram was 371. The survey also asked, as I mentioned, about whether the CEO uses social media for professional purposes. And I found that 48.2% said that they did not. 43% said that they did, and the remaining were unsure whether they did or not. As for the Twitter metrics, I just want to note that only accounts with more than 100 followers could be analyzed by the site Fanpage Karma, so those were the only ones included. And these were looked at over a 1-month period. There were 85 organizations that fit this criteria and were included in this analysis. Here are some of the highlights of the metrics that I found. The average performance index was 26%. And as I mentioned earlier, this is calculated based on how the page compares to all other Twitter accounts that have ever been analyzed on FanPage Karma. And so it's a percentile system, which means that on average, these organizations rank below 74% of other organizations' pages. On average, these organizations are tweeting a little less than once per day and receive less than one like or retweet per day. And this translates to a very low engagement rate of 0.1%. There's also a conversation rate of 1.7%, which that is determined by the ratio of mentions or replies, those kinds of tweets, in comparison to all the tweets. Moving on to Facebook. The Facebook performance was slightly better. The page performance index was at 29%. And despite posting less often than on Twitter, these posts received significantly more engagement. So they posted an average of 25 times per month and garnered 1,900 total likes, comments, and shares on those posts. FanPage Karma also tracks the type of post, meaning whether it has a photo, video, or link. And as you can see, a majority of the posts do include photos, which is significant because photo posts are generally regarded as one of the best ways to get engagement on Facebook. And another cool thing that FanPage Karma does with Facebook is they have an ad value calculator. So they look at the number of impressions that the post got and calculate how much it would cost to get that many impressions on a Facebook ad. And so you can see the average ad value of these pages was almost $1,500. Moving on to the perception of communications efforts. So there's no doubt that nonprofit organizations recognize the importance of strong communications efforts and the growth of their organizations. As you can see, 91% agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. They also recognize that there's room for improvement in what they're doing, which is really great. Close to 90% agreed with that as well. However, not so surprisingly, many suggested that it was a lack of resources that was standing in their way and stopping them from improving those efforts. 50% of the respondents either agreed or strongly agreed that they felt their organization dedicates too few resources to communications, and 63% either agreed or strongly agreed that they would like to increase their communications efforts, but they feel they don't have the resources. So these seem like they're really similar, but the difference is the first is referring to allocation of resources, where the second one is more generally the resources. So the first one is speaking to how the organization is using their resources, and I think that perhaps requiring them to include their organization name may have affected the response to this question. I think if it had been anonymous, perhaps organizations, the people filling this out would have been more likely to say that, yeah, my organization, I wish they did contribute more resources to communications. There was less agreement when it came to the perception of social media. So respondents were pretty split on whether they felt their organization had an adequate social media presence. And they were also split on whether they plan to increase their presence within the next 6 months. That one leans a little more positive, but it's still not as definitive as the other statements. Another aspect that I mentioned was the main purpose of social media for the organization. So for this question, they were given the option of to encourage followers to attend events, donate, volunteer, etc., to disseminate information about the organization, and to create a dialogue with the community. And as I mentioned, this was based off the 2012 study that I talked about earlier. In that study, only 1.6% of tweets were considered action-oriented, which is interesting when nearly 48% of respondents in my survey view that as the main purpose of social media for them. Similarly, though, a large portion identified information dissemination as their main focus, which was the case here. And only 16.2% of respondents in my survey selected creating a dialogue with the community as the main purpose. But I just want to note that this was asking for the main purpose. And I think that perhaps a better way to have structured this question would have been to make it a ranking, so you could see really like what the main purpose is, but also how they view the other two options as well. And in fact, I had multiple respondents who emailed me and said that they would have chosen all three if they had the option. So a lot of this project was focused on, as I mentioned, how human services organizations compare to animal-related. So here's an overview of those results. In terms of traditional communications efforts, I found that human services organizations were more likely to have a full-time or part-time staff member responsible for their communications efforts, while animal-related organizations were more likely to leave the responsibility to a volunteer. Considering that there was no significant difference in the average annual revenue of these organizations, that's particularly interesting, I think. As for newsletters, there was no difference in whether they had a newsletter or not, or how often that they sent it. But there was a difference in press releases. Human services organizations were more likely to send out press releases, which could be due to the fact that they have a staff member in charge of, or in this role. With general social media usage, there were no significant differences in the number of social media accounts or the number of followers on these accounts, with the exception of Facebook. As you can see here, animal-related organizations had an average of approximately 6,000 followers, while human services organizations had around 1,000. So, for example, these are a couple of the organizations that were included in this study. And so animal-related organizations ranged from those like the Resolution Horse Company, which had about less than 100 likes on the page, to Boxer Love Rescue, which had more than 200,000. For human services organizations, there was a lot of variance as well. There were organizations such as Grandparents and Residents, which have 11 likes on their page, to Make-A-Wish Arizona, which has close to 10,000. And there's a lot of reasons why this could be the case. And it could be that human services organizations are not dedicating as much time or effort to their Facebook pages, but it could also be several other things as well. So, as I mentioned, many human services organizations deal with vulnerable populations. That could make sharing information on social media difficult. It could also be related to the fact that animal-related organizations have a much more narrow focus that guides what they do. And lastly, I mean, like visual content does really well on most of these platforms, and animal-related organizations have a virtually endless supply of cute animal photos to share, so that could be it too. As for whether their CEOs were active on social media, there was no significant differences between the two types of organizations. And in terms of Twitter usage engagement, there were also no significant differences in 13 of the 14 metrics that I mentioned earlier, and that you can see all 14 of them here in this table. The metric retweeted was the only one that there was a significant difference, and this metric refers to how often the organization retweets other users. So essentially this means that human services organizations retweet their followers and other users more often than animal-related. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, Facebook usage and engagement was measured by 21 different variables. All of them are shown here. And unlike Twitter, there was a significant difference between the two types of organizations. All the ones in bold are ones that there were significant differences. So the results showed that animal-related organizations had higher page performance indexes, higher ad value, total posts, posts by fans, photo posts, total likes, comments, and shares, and which goes along with that is engagement. But despite all this, there were no significant differences in the follower growth. So this suggests that animal-related organizations have a very, very engaged follower base, but they face a lot of the same difficulties that human services organizations do when it comes to actually increasing these followers. As for the perception of communications efforts, the analysis showed no significant differences in 5 of the 6 Likert scale questions that I went over, or statements that I went over earlier. The only one that there was a difference was I plan to increase my organization's social media within the next 6 months. But it's not really conclusive because basically it showed that animal-related organizations are more likely to strongly disagree, or strongly agree with this statement. So I guess they just feel a lot more strongly about it, either way. In terms of the main purpose of social media, there were no differences in how the organizations answered these questions. So, I know that was a lot of information, so I'm just going to summarize it very quickly and look at it in terms of my hypotheses. So the first one was that there was a significant difference between the 2 types of organizations with respect to traditional communication. Considering that there was a difference between the position responsible and press release distribution, but not newsletter distribution and frequency, I consider that hypothesis partially correct. The second hypothesis on general social media usage was rejected because there were no differences in the number of social media accounts, no difference in the followers on any of the platforms except for Facebook, and no difference in whether the CEO actively used social media. For Twitter usage and engagement, as I said, most of the metrics, there were no differences. So that was rejected as well. But for Facebook, there were differences on more than half of the metrics that I considered. And so I think that it's appropriate to then say that there is a significant difference in how these organizations are using and engaging with their stakeholders on Facebook. So that hypothesis is accepted. With respect to perception of communications tactics, as I mentioned, there were no differences in most of the Likert scale statements, no difference in the main purpose of social media, and so that one is rejected. And so, lastly, I'd just like to briefly go over the limitations of this study and how it can be built upon in the future. So, although I had a fairly large sample size and there was a lot of variation in terms of revenue, it's important to know that these were only organizations that had contact emails and websites available, and these are only 2 types when there's so many different classifications of nonprofit organizations. This makes it somewhat difficult to generalize the findings to the entire sector, but it is valuable to animal-related and human services organizations in particular. With respect to the social media data, it was only 1 month of data. Other tools give you the ability to look at 3 months, 6 months, and that would just help to give a more broad picture of their social media usage. And another thing is that I did not conduct any sort of content analysis, so I was just looking at the numbers and that behind their Facebook pages and not necessarily what they were posting. And some possibilities for future studies would be using revenue as a comparative factor to really see if there's differences in how small and large organizations use social media and communicate with their stakeholders. Some other considerations would be conducting qualitative research, such as interviews or focus groups, because you could really get more into the perceptions and the motivations that way. Exploring platforms beyond Facebook and Twitter would be valuable, especially as we saw YouTube is becoming more and more popular. And considering different subsectors other than animal-related and human services organizations. There's a lot of work to be done in understanding the sector as a whole. So with that, I thank you all, and I welcome your questions.
First of all, excellent job on your study and just very impressive. And I loved how you took it and put it into a beautiful presentation for all of us because sometimes academia, just reading, it's really difficult. So I thought you really captured it, and especially because social media, your study really, we need to look at social media, and you did a good job of bringing it, because looking at a picture and a visual is really important. So I thought that. So I was interested in the question. I am a pretty new CEO in the field, and so I wanted to ask you more about being a CEO, and basically just have you re-summarize that if you felt that the CEOs who were engaged on social media and as that #1 user, I think it was 40-some%, were from large organizations or small startup organizations, and did you look into that at all?
I didn't look into that, but just by looking at the data, not analysis of it, it did seem that it was organizations that were smaller, that really it was a one-man show or a one-woman show, that they didn't have any other option. They were running it and they had to do it. So I don't have any data necessarily on that.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, a couple of questions. For some of the general, some of kind of specific. When you have pretty much you just choose 2 different types of organization, nonprofit organizations, and then you hypothesize they will be kind of different in so many kind of areas in terms of traditional media or the social media. What are the reasons why you think they are significantly different?
It was mainly based on the annual contributions, and just that they're very different types of organizations. Like human and animal, that's about as different as you can get in terms of like nonprofits, because most nonprofits do deal with some sort of human services, whether they're classified that way or not.
Okay. So you don't have the information regarding the average revenue for these 2 groups, right?
Yes, the average revenue was actually for these groups was the same, or similar. It was
Similar,
around
okay.
$200,000 in annual revenue for both.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
So do you have kind of information regarding their average the personnel or staffers, kind of size of the organization?
Yeah, so it was an average of 40 employees, I believe.
Okay.
There was. But that was based on only the 44% that had the full Form 990.
No. I know this is the average. I mean the 2 groups, the
okay.
different group.
No, I did not look at
Okay,
that separately.
because this is very, I think, important information, additional kind of information. In addition to the revenue, if they have on average is very large organization as compared to another group, that may give you further whatever kind of reasons as to why. Because right now you look at it in the entire group, but you want to compare these 2 groups, so you need to look at these 2. You look at there's a difference between Twitter and Facebook when you look at the metrics. Okay, one is there's no kind of material whatever difference at all, but on Facebook you can see the difference between these 2 groups. Any reason why, in addition to the animal, other things?
Not necessarily. I know that I follow a lot of the animal-related organizations, and it seems like, as I mentioned, it's the narrow focus. People are just very passionate about animals, and it doesn't matter which of these rescues it is, like they're passionate about saving animals. Whereas human services organizations, they focus in on one issue that is difficult to get as many people behind. I think that's what it is.
So all these numbers, actually you input it to the software yourself, right? From their 990.
Yeah, the Form 990 information, and then the number of followers on each social media account I inputted.
Actually, I think in addition to the average number for all of them, I think it would be great if you can have the different groups average. For example, average number of volunteers for the animal related, how many of them, and for the human resources. I think that will give you a better kind of a contrast or comparison between these 2. Do you have any, because you in the literature review talk about it's not a lot of these organizations, they use social media, but it's not in an engaging way. Why is that?
It's difficult.
Why is it difficult?
It's difficult because it takes takes time to really establish those relationships. It's a lot easier to just push out information and not really worry about like engaging with people, because you have that, like I said, it takes a lot of time to do that.
Okay. Any reasons that they don't have the skilled personnel to really kind of fully understand what social media is about, and then they can utilize this understanding to promote the case?
Yeah, I think it's just a general lack of resources, but I think this is something that all businesses are struggling to really understand how to use social media in a way that engages. I think that probably a majority of businesses are using it to just to push out information, and I think maybe it's because social media is so new, we're trying to figure out how to best use it.
Actually, the question that I may phrase it another way. The reason I'm asking the question is, do you think it takes an expert to really work on this social media kind of platform to make it more effective? Or a trained
Yeah, I think
person now?
an expert in that they have done a lot to learn about it. So maybe not necessarily someone like me who went to school for it, but there's a lot of resources online that you can educate yourself on, and I think someone who learned that way could be just as effective. And one thing I didn't mention but I wanted to point out is that it seems that a lot of the cases when volunteers are running things like communication or things like that, several said that their board members were involved in it too. Is that could be their profession as well, and they're volunteering their skills to that nonprofit.
Okay, actually the reason I'm asking is in the future you are going to be a consultant or expert in social media kind of platform. I think it's fair to say it really takes some skills, training, or experience to be effectively communicate with your audience. And also that's the reason why a lot of youngsters, new graduates, they are better positioned to manage the social media account because they are grown up with all this kind of information, so they are better. So it really takes a lot of experience, expertise, or understanding to promote it rather than just you kind of open register kind of account and that's it. Because there's the presence of it, availability of this social media account doesn't equate with communication. So you need to really take some further efforts to do that. So I think part of the research you are doing here is try to find out not only what, how, but also why behind it. Okay, whether they have difference or they are totally the same. There's a reason behind it. Why they don't kind of differ in this regard.
So
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
earlier you mentioned that way early in the presentation about tweets not being shared. It was like really low, 1 point something.
Yeah.
So is social media helping these organizations? You know, is it bringing in new people, or is it just helping people who are interested find out more information about it?
I think that right now it's doing what you said, just helping people find information. I don't think that it is truly being used to engage. As I mentioned with the Facebook pages, the animal-related organizations had a lot of engagement, a lot of comments and shares and likes, but they weren't growing any faster. And so I think really there's a lot of work to be done in terms of engaging people.
And second question, probably a little bit off, but because you know, 197 nonprofits. Now, would, like, say for instance, animal organizations with like interests, would they benefit more by collaborating and not having so many? Would, you know, have one more efficient?
That is a good question.
I know it's not totally dealing with what you're talking about, but
I think that there is some room for consolidation. There's a lot of overlap in missions, and in some cases merging nonprofits is beneficial because they can be more efficient. But in the case of animal ones, I can see the need for, there's a lot of breed-specific rescues, and I can see the need for having that sort of thing. But I think there is probably room for merging.
thank you. Good job, by the way.
So kind of along the same lines, you talked about how the animal related nonprofits and then the human services related nonprofits had about the same number of followers, despite the fact that there was a little bit more engagement with the animal nonprofits. But do you think that they were and I know you said you didn't do a lot of content analysis, but you follow a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
So do you feel like they post a lot more, posts that require engagement and reaching out to the community, or do you think that they're still just pushing information?
I think that they're largely pushing information, and I do honestly believe a lot of it has to do with cute animals. I mean, really, of all the pages that I've followed, the things that get the most engagement are like, oh, this cute dog is up for adoption, and tons of people share it. Another thing is when there's lost dogs, sometimes people will bring lost dogs to shelters, and they'll post, hey, somebody brought in this dog, is it yours? And people are really good about that. They'll share it because this community is just really tight knit, and they just really want to to help other animal lovers. Yes.
This was really fascinating, and I think to your point too, the director's point, you revealed a really cool challenge, and it just seems like, again, we've all kind of touched on it, but no matter what the level of activity, both groups are having trouble building new followers. How do you get the new people that already, so that was interesting, and like you said again also, that it kind of proves as well the need for expertise in the area, because activity doesn't equal success, I don't know, but
Yeah.
I think that's neat. Did you have an opinion on how they could build followers?
I think that just trying to engage. I mean, so
Magic question.
Patty's my boss, and what I try to do
She's awesome, by the way.
at MCOR is even though I know we don't have a lot of followers and I know we don't get a lot of engagement, I just keep trying. I just keep on putting questions out there to see if maybe someone will answer. An example of that is we recently ran ads, and I said for a State Farm hiring event, and I said to tag a friend to try to get them to not just look at it, but engage with it, and try to get people to this hiring event. So tag a friend who's looking for a job, and people did it. And so, I was surprised by that, honestly. I was hoping it would work, and it did. And so I think just to keep on trying, and eventually I think, people will start to realize and start to engage with you.
And we have grown followers, by the way, too. 500
For the
a year
record.
on Twitter,
Right.
from organic. So that was a great idea that you tested there. It's experimentation.
Actually, the whole social media platform, even the research about it is kind of relatively new.
Mm-hmm.
We still can try to kind of learn by doing it. And from the academic perspective, even because for us, when we do a research like this, it takes about a year sometimes to get it done and get it published. And after the kind of publication, the thing is already kind of outdated because things change so fast. So I think that compared to the traditional media that has been there for kind of 100 years, 50 years, so people have a better understanding. But for the social media has been changing so quite dramatically. Just some examples like, okay, there's some publication about why MySpace was so successful, but actually once it got published, MySpace is really gone. So that is the pace and also the dramatic I think difference really it poses a challenge not only for the practitioners and also even for the researchers trying to study it, because this is like a moving target and changing all the way.
Mm-hmm.
So but I think so that's the reason why I'm emphasizing it takes expertise. Although we still kind of try to learn it, but you have to really know a lot of knowledge about communication, PR, and also even social psychology, sociology to really understand it, to make it a better platform for organization. Just one kind of suggestion. Go back to the two statements. You have 5 statements. When you show the numbers, no, go down.
Wait, forward or back?
Forward,
the beginning?
forward, yeah, toward the end.
Toward the end.
Wow. Hi, doctor.
Hello.
Hi,
How are you?
yeah, good. Actually, this one, we still kind of in the first defense, not yet, almost finished. It's better call back, I think in 10 minutes. How about in 10
That'll
minutes?
be great.
Okay.
Talk to you then.
All right,
Bye-bye.
okay, bye-bye. Oh, it's already one on.
This one?
Yeah, this one.
Okay.
Actually, I think the number here is the raw number, right?
Yes.
Okay, I think it's better to post the percentage when you pick
Okay.
it. Yeah, I think that's clearer because you talk about this overall kind of distribution, so that's percentage is a bit better. Okay, any other questions? Okay, okay, shall we talk outside? Yeah.
What are they gonna go talk about?
Whether they're approving my project or not.
Whether what?
Are you nervous?
Yeah.
Whether
No.
they're gonna-
No, that's fine.
So what do you guys work on?
Maricopa Corporate College, and it's part of the Maricopa Community College.
Corporate
Yeah.
CEOs type programs?
Yeah. We do corporate training, so corporate training versus
Right.
skill training, non-degree. Alex, need some cookies?
Okay, I think we are going to officially congratulate you. Just want to say a couple words regarding this oral research. It's very impressive, and actually it's not only the data. I think this is one of the most extensive data collecting studies I have been kind of directing, and also is in terms of the depths of the data analysis also very high. Actually, I recommend yesterday we talked about this. I recommend her to revise this paper and shorten it, pack it up to be. I think that has the potential to present in an academic conference, because some of the things here she discovered has I think it's graduate student level in terms of the writing, the design, the oral structure. I think it's very set a very high bar for. So I'm very pleased with the kind of final outcome.
I just wanted to congratulate you again too. You were an excellent student of mine in fundraising and resource development. I can see what you're doing here, the study. Perhaps some study someday is going to link the donors and fundraising with how well they do on social media, the linkage, the interest. I see like growing the social media and the fundraising. There's definitely a correlation there. So big things coming up for you. So great job.
Thank you.
Okay, so now you have the page for us? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for coming. Actually, we have another session with you guys, so we're running a little bit late. Okay. Good job. Great job.
Congratulations. Thanks for having us.
Okay.
Oh, did you want the